If you've ever watched Psycho or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you've already stepped into the shadow cast by Ed Gein, but those films only hinted at the truth. In Plainfield, Wisconsin, police tied him to 2 murders, Mary Hogan in 1954 and Bernice Worden in 1957, and he admitted to robbing graves. His house was not a set for horror, but a record of ritual. Each mask, each artifact, carried traces of a man trying to reconstruct his mother from corpses. We'll trace the arc that led there: a controlled childhood, a grief that spiraled, practice in cemeteries, and finally, murder. A childhood under control. His earliest years show how a life can be constrained long before any crime occurs. The family left La Crosse and moved to a remote farmstead in Plainfield, Wisconsin, where distance, isolation, and a dominating parent created the conditions that shaped him. At the center was Augusta Gein, a deeply religious woman whose rigid worldview set every limit on her sons' lives. Her husband George, an alcoholic who struggled to hold jobs, faded into the background, leaving Augusta not only the voice of authority, but the only voice that mattered. Plainfield was a small farming community where neighbors lived by the cycles of land and church. Yet Augusta deliberately kept her children apart. She taught Ed and his brother Henry strict moral rules and condemned others, especially women, as corrupt and dangerous. Religious readings focused not on compassion, but on sin, punishment, and damnation. Neighbors would later recall Ed as friendless, never allowed to bring playmates home. The isolation was not accidental. It was deliberate. Education outside the farm was limited to the basics of school, but any lessons in friendship or trust ended at Augusta's door. Life in the household moved wholly to her rhythm. Daily chores on the farm filled the hours, and Bible verses selected by Augusta filled the space afterward. She drew heavily from the Old Testament and Revelation, passages thick with judgment, violence, and divine wrath. For a boy attempting to understand the world, those lessons framed human contact as perilous and obedience as the only safety. The result was clear. Instead of developing ordinary peer relationships, Ed's social life fused almost entirely to his mother's instructions. His identity remained tethered to her rules, not to peer life or community. With no access to friendships, Ed sought substitute outlets. He read widely, but what held his attention most were medical texts, crime accounts, and lurid wartime reports. Stories of body parts, cannibalism, and atrocities occupied the place where companionship might have been. One figure he studied was Ilse Koch, the wife of a Nazi commandant known for her collection of human skin. Such reading did not create his isolation, but it gave it shape, giving imagery to an imagination already cut off from healthier influences. Seen from the outside, Ed came across as quiet, hardworking, even timid. Neighbors had no reason to suspect danger. The farm kept him busy, and his mother's control masked inner currents. But under that surface, the dependency grew. Augusta's fear of the outside world became his, reinforced each day through separation and repetition. A farm, in most cases, trained boys for self-reliance and responsibility. This farm instead trained obedience without independence. The dynamic carried forward year by year. As neighbors' sons built friendships in the schoolyard or began work of their own, Ed remained homebound, his skills pointed inward. Even his relationship with his brother was shaped by Augusta's commands, not personal choice. His life centered on her presence, both for order and for meaning. It was not simply that he admired her. He relied on her to define reality. That reliance carried consequences. Every child eventually confronts a moment when parental guidance fades, through illness, death, or simple distance. But Ed Gein had never rehearsed that independence. He had no practice in decision-making, no learned way to share grief, no ability to measure choices against his own judgment. The conditions of his upbringing did not prepare him for adulthood. They left him vulnerable the moment his mother's voice fell silent. And soon, that silence would come. The death that unlocked obsession. The decisive shift came with the death of Augusta Gein on December 29, 1945. By that point, Ed's father had died in 1940, and his brother Henry was gone as well. lost in a 1944 brush fire officially ruled accidental, but later questioned due to observed bruising. These losses left Augusta as his final anchor, and when she passed at 67, the last stable bond in his life was removed. Biographical accounts note that Ed had cared for her intensely during her declining health, making her absence even harder to accept. What followed was a tangible division inside the Plainfield farmhouse. Investigators later observed that rooms Augusta had used, the parlor, sitting room, and upstairs quarters, were shut off from daily life. Curtains stayed drawn, furniture stayed dust-free, and nothing was touched. They remained preserved like sealed containers of memory. In contrast, the rest of the house decayed rapidly. Paint peeled, floors went unwashed, and trash accumulated. The split became literal, one part of the home frozen as if its occupant could return at any time, the other falling into neglect and ruin. The physical setting matched the psychological divide that now structured Ed's days. The depth of his attachment became clearer in his behavior after the funeral. Augusta was not just a parent in his mind. She had been his one point of contact with the outside world, his moral compass, and his most enduring relationship. Once she was gone, there was no network of friends, no spouse, no social ties to take her place. The void she left did not diminish with time. Records indicate his isolation deepened, and in the absence of any balancing influence, he turned inward to sustain the illusion of her presence. This period also aligns with a measurable escalation in his behavior. Around 1947, 2 years after Augusta's death, the cemetery became central to his nightly routines. His fixation shifted from preserved household rooms to the graves of women who bore some physical similarity to his mother. Where most grieved through companionship or faith, Ed converted mourning into ritual conduct. His solitude left him no other outlet. The pattern followed a clear sequence. His father had provided little guidance. His brother's death, although considered an accident, removed the only nearby check on Augusta's dominance. When she too was gone, Ed was left without human contact. Instead of stabilizing, his world contracted further. For other men of his age, the late 1940s and 1950s were years of family life, employment, and community roles. For Ed, those paths were blocked. He had grown up under rules that discouraged trust, and he lacked the practice of independence. The absence drove him towards substitutes. His preferred reading, medical texts and crime stories, gave him imagery of physical control and bodily preservation. The ideas fused with memory of his mother's presence, suggesting both a target and a method. Experts describe this as a fusion of unresolved hostility, distorted sexuality, and an overriding need to reclaim the maternal figure he could not let go. Some sources suggest schizophrenia and associated delusions underpinned these shifts, helping explain his disconnection from reality and his belief in resurrecting the dead through possession of their bodies. The consequences became visible as years passed. Mary Hogan, a tavern owner in the area, disappeared in December 1954. 3 years later, in November 1957, Bernice Worden, a hardware store owner, was killed. But before those murders came smaller acts. The evidence shows that Gein's pattern of grave robbing had already been in motion long before. Coffins were disturbed, remains taken, and in some cases, pieces were kept. These early intrusions were not impulsive crimes, but rehearsals fed by his grief and shaped by his obsession. What makes this stage critical is how his coping strategy turned material. Instead of keeping memory through objects like photos or clothing, he placed actual bodies into the process. The sealed rooms of his farmhouse show the denial of his mother's loss. The cemetery visits extended the denial into action, attempting to repair an absence by manipulating remains. By the late 1940s, his descent had set a clear trajectory. His world was limited to a farm in disrepair, preserved shrines to his mother, and increasingly compulsive rituals among graves. Every element tied back to the same pivot point. Augusta's death removed his only contact and set in motion behavior that could not be reversed. And it was in those dark routines, under the cover of night in Plainfield cemeteries, that the next stage of his obsession began to take shape: the nights among graves. In those years after Augusta's death, Plainfield's graveyards became central to Gein's hidden routines. Investigators later learned from his own statements that he made as many as 40 nocturnal visits between 1947 and 1952. He admitted to desecrating 9 graves, though physical evidence later suggested the true number was higher. His focus fell on middle-aged women who resembled his mother. Obituaries in the local paper guided his choices, listing names and recent burials that matched his criteria. Gein described some of these trips as daze-like, claiming he sometimes broke free of the impulse before finishing. On nearly 30 occasions, according to his confession, he left the graveyard without disturbing the coffin. But when the compulsion took hold, he exhumed the newly buried, pried-open caskets and carried parts of the corpse back to his farm. The behavior showed a constant tension in his mind, a force pulling him toward the act, and another part recoiling when it became too real. Law enforcement later put parts of his story to the test. Graves he had named were exhumed, and the condition of the coffins confirmed much of what he described. Some boxes were cracked open, others had bodies partly missing. In one case, tools he left behind were recovered. The forensic corroboration gave investigators assurance that his confessions were not exaggerations. Still, his words and the evidence did not perfectly align. He confessed to 9 acts, but the farmhouse eventually gave up remains from far more people. Inside that house, police cataloged 12 human heads, along with other preserved bones and skin. It became clear that the scale of his grave robbing exceeded his account. Some remains were matched to missing graves, while others could never be fully traced. The discrepancy produced lingering doubt over how many cemeteries he actually raided. His admitted 9 thefts were only part of a larger pattern. What made the acts stand out was their purpose. Gein took no valuables from the graves. He did not remove wedding rings or jewelry to sell. Instead, he cut away skin, harvested bones, and brought them back as raw material. These were incorporated into masks, bowls, and stitched objects investigators later found in his home. He described the impulse as an attempt to keep his mother with him, though the ritual was far from a memorial. It was a reconstruction, piecemeal attempts to fashion something new from the dead. In this period, the farmhouse became a kind of workshop. Each skull was shaped into an ornament. Each strip of skin had a designated place. The grave-robbing visits had a clear role. They kept the supply steady. What he could not retain from his mother's preserved rooms, he tried to rebuild from the bodies of women who resembled her. This was not theft for profit, but practice aimed at physical replication. The focus on resemblance underlined his fixation. Augusta was forever the model against which all others were measured. By returning again and again to burials of women who echoed her features, he blurred the line between grief and substitution. To him, acquiring their parts meant restoring her presence in some tangible way. The effect on the community was invisible at the time. Families buried their dead without realizing the graves might soon be disturbed. Quiet headstones masked the secret traffic. Only later, after police confronted the evidence, did the townspeople grasp how often their cemeteries had been visited under cover of darkness. Through these years, the cycle remained limited to the already deceased, but the ritual had a limit. He could stitch, preserve, and build, yet the figures he created never spoke, never moved, never embodied the living presence he wanted to recover. The emptiness of that failure pressed against him, and when that pressure could no longer be contained by corpses alone, his behavior crossed into something more direct, crossing the line into murder. Mary Hogan's disappearance in December 1954 marked the first recorded homicide. She ran a tavern in a nearby town and was last seen there before vanishing without a trace. At the time, suspicion circulated, but no evidence linked anyone to her case. It remained unsolved until 3 years later, when investigators searching Gein's property found her severed head among his possessions. That discovery confirmed what had been unknown for years. Hogan had been killed by Gein. The move from grave robbing to the murder of a living woman signaled an escalation in his behavior. In November 1957, the second killing exposed him completely. Bernice Worden, 58 years old, owned a hardware store in Plainfield. On the morning of November 16th, customers found the store unattended. Blood was visible on the floor. Her son, Frank Worden, also a deputy sheriff, quickly realized something was wrong. Reviewing the till, investigators recovered the final sales slip, 1 gallon of antifreeze sold to Ed Gein. It bore his name, giving officers a direct and immediate lead. Deputies moved to Gain's farm that same day. Their search uncovered Bernice Worden's body inside a shed on the property. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, confirmed by later forensic analysis. Her body showed clear post-mortem mutilation consistent with the alterations Gein had already practiced on stolen corpses. Unlike the grave robberies, this was not an intrusion on the dead. This was homicide followed by ritual handling, the quick chain of evidence, blood at the store, the antifreeze receipt, her son's involvement, and the body found on Gein's land left no doubt. Investigators linked Gein within hours of Worden's disappearance. But the method he employed illustrated what had changed. Where earlier desecrations had offered raw material, murder granted him direct control, living proximity, and bodies that matched his preference for women resembling his mother's age and form. The selection was deliberate. Both Hogan and Worden fell within the category of middle-aged women who echoed Augusta Gein. He admitted under questioning that resemblance to his mother was part of his choice. That pattern showed clear continuity with his grave selections, where obituaries guided his exhumations. It also made the escalation logical within his pathology. Grave robbing had given him practice handling bodies. When that no longer met the need, homicide supplied fresher sources that fit his obsession more precisely. Forensic inspection later tied the two murders together. Hogan's remains offered proof that Gein had committed murder well before Worden's disappearance. Worden's body, discovered almost immediately, demonstrated to law enforcement that what had once been whispered speculation was in fact an ongoing pattern of violence. The parallel cases charted a progression. 3 years separated the acts, but both revealed the same ritual framework and motive. The escalation meant that Gein's crimes had crossed a fragile line. He was no longer a recluse stealing from the dead. He had become an active killer. That breach carried consequences far beyond Plainfield. It altered the way investigators understood the remains and artifacts that would soon be cataloged inside his home. The two murders also highlighted the clear path of an error chain. His isolated upbringing created dependency. His mother's death deepened that into fixation. Grave robbery became his experiment, providing skill with corpses and a controlled setting. Then the progression broke containment. By 1954, the urge reached into the lives of others, and by 1957, it left a trail that investigators could not miss. His downfall illustrates how fixation, once unchallenged, can escalate into predation. When officers stepped into his farmhouse after Bernice Worden's body was found, they realized that what lay inside would eclipse even the shock of the murders. Inside the House of Artifacts, inside the Plainfield farmhouse, investigators encountered not just squalor, but a workshop of macabre artifacts organized around a single obsession. Trash and decay were expected, but what shocked officers was the systematic transformation of human remains into household objects. Each discovery revealed how Gein's private rituals had taken physical form. Among the items most firmly documented were skulls repurposed as bowls, a lampshade stitched out of human skin, and chairs upholstered with strips of flesh. A belt threaded with preserved nipples was found alongside masks fashioned from the faces of women. In a shoebox, detectives discovered multiple sets of female genitalia. Jars and bags contained organs, including a human heart. These were not curiosities scattered at random, but arranged pieces of evidence showing intent and repetition. The most infamous item was what Gein himself described to investigators: a full-body woman suit made from the skin of female victims. It included torso sections and leggings, constructed with the stated purpose of wearing it so that, in his words, he could simulate becoming his mother. Unlike many other artifacts, this was designed for use, not display, an attempt at embodiment rather than ornament. What made the scene particularly haunting was the contrast inside the house itself. Certain rooms, namely Augusta's parlor and bedroom, remained locked away and spotless years after her death. They held her presence in memory. Meanwhile, nearby spaces were littered with the grotesque artifacts Gein built in his solitude. The house was split between shrine and workshop, between reverence and reconstruction. That split expressed his larger psychological break, one half preserving her absence, the other half forcing her imagined return. Not every object could be traced to a known victim. In 1957, forensic science lacked DNA testing. Identification instead relied on dental charts, missing person reports, and circumstantial comparisons. Many items remained impossible to conclusively match, leaving the true victim count unresolved. The physical evidence spoke of more deaths and disturbances than Gein ever confessed, and even careful cataloging could not close that gap. For investigators, the situation required structure. Each item, whether bone, skin, or organ, was photographed where it lay, logged as evidence, and then stored. Many were later destroyed following legal proceedings. This process highlighted that, however disturbing the discoveries were, they were still subject to procedure. Evidence gathering had to meet standards of documentation, not emotion. The farmhouse thus became both a crime scene and a case study, used to translate horror into admissible proof. The scope of the collection underscored the duration and planning involved. Skulls shaped as bowls and masks trimmed to fit suggested repetition and refinement, not single moments of impulse. The belt of nipples and organs kept in jars demonstrated an ongoing ritual logic, not randomness. Each artifact pointed back to the same pattern of need: a son unable to accept his mother's death and unwilling to leave her absence unaddressed. The implications extended beyond law enforcement. When these discoveries entered public record, they redefined the cultural imagination of crime. Until that point, the imagery of skin masks or human furniture was confined to fiction or rumor. After the farmhouse was opened and cataloged, those images became rooted in fact. Journalists reported them. Court documents confirmed them. The horror was no longer speculative. It was material and preserved in photographs. The error chain had reached its terminal point. Isolation had bred dependence. Her death had created fixation. Grave robbing had offered practice. Murder created immediacy. And the house revealed the end product: a physical environment remodeled to embody obsession. Every wall, chair, and artifact illustrated not chaos, but an organized effort to collapse the divide between memory and presence. By the time the farmhouse was emptied, Gein's crimes could no longer be thought of as isolated killings or robberies. They were evidence of an overriding project, repeated attempts to construct his mother from the bodies of others. That realization brings us to the broader meaning of his story, the point where crime, grief, and obsession intersect to explain not only what he did, but why. Ed Gein's fate was sealed not in the farmhouse, but in the courts. Declared unfit for trial in 1957, he was committed to Central State Hospital. In 1968, he faced trial for Bernice Worden's murder. The court found him not guilty by reason of insanity, and he spent the rest of his life institutionalized. He died in July 1984 from lung cancer at the age of 77. His legacy extended beyond Plainfield. Robert Bloch used him as inspiration for Norman Bates in Psycho. Leatherface in The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs followed. Each drew elements from Gein's documented crimes. Community responses were immediate. His farmhouse, scheduled for auction, was burned in March 1958 to prevent it from becoming a morbid tourist site. His car was later sold as a sideshow attraction. Experts and locals long described the case as one of the most shocking in U.S. criminal history. It showed how isolation, untreated mental illness, and fixation can align into a destructive error chain. The true terror isn't the mask, it's the lonely man behind it. If you found this useful, like the video and subscribe for more hard-hitting explainers. Hit the bell to be notified.